First of all, on behalf of Terry Lacaze and Richard Carpentier, the other PIs in the CHEER project, and all of the investigators and collaborators across the CHEER project, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we got started, we thought we'd just give a very quick overview of the CHEER project, just for people who are not familiar with it. Thank you, Sam, so much for sharing the slide. So this slide gives you an overview of the CHEER project just very quickly. It's a CIHR-funded project, a 5-year project, and what we're trying to do is achieve a single research ethics review for multi-site child health studies in Canada. So this project is led by Clinical Trials Ontario. That's the organization that I work with. And by the way, I always forget to introduce myself, but I'm Susan Marlin, and I work with Clinical Trials Ontario, and we're partnered with MyCER and the Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network. And Terry Lacaze, one of the PIs, is the scientific director for that network. And we're working with collaborators across the country to try and get this done. One of the key parts of the CHEER project is an education program, a research ethics education program targeted to REBs and REB members, targeted to investigators and research coordinators, research teams submitting projects for research ethics review and actually conducting the research. And as well, some of it is targeted to patients and families. So Sam, I'll just move to the next slide. Thank you. And this slide just kind of goes over what we're looking to do over the project in terms of research ethics education. So we're working very closely with the Queen's University Office for Professional Development and Educational Scholarship in the Faculty of Health Sciences to develop online modules, which will be high quality, lasting educational modules in the areas that we've listed on this slide. That's one piece of the educational program. The other, and I just refer down to the bottom section, supports for patients and family members on REBs. So under Antonia Palmer's leadership, we're looking at developing educational resources for patients and family members who sit on our REBs. And we're also looking at offering dynamic content throughout the course of the project, so workshops and webinars. And I'm very happy to say this is the first of our workshops that we're offering. This was Antonia's idea that we could offer one around the role of the community member, which is such an important role on our REBs. This would be our first workshop. So with that, first of all, I'll thank Gerard and Jack and Antonia for doing this today. And thank you, Sam, for putting everything together. And I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Before we introduce the speakers and get to know a bit about who is in this virtual room, I'll just let you know that this session is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides for later viewing. The structure of this workshop will be approximately 1 hour of presentations, followed by a 30-minute discussion period. Now, to get a sense of who is in attendance today, it would be great if you could follow the link that will be posted in the chat just now and indicate what your role is with respect to research ethics review. For example, you might enter community member, researcher, research ethics coordinator, etc. The anonymous results will show up live here as you respond. So we'll just give a minute or so for the results to come in. So just follow that link that Christine posted in the chat to enter your response. Wonderful. So it's looking like we have a lot of community REB members, researchers, research ethics specialists, some REB chairs, REB leads, study coordinators, among a number of different roles. So welcome, everyone. I think we'll have a great discussion with this group. So now that we've learned a bit more about who is joining with this in this workshop, I'll just introduce our speakers for today who have kindly prepared presentations and reflections on the role of community members on REBs. So first we have Antonia Palmer, the Chair, Patient and Family Advisory Committee Chair. Next, we have Gerard McDonald, who is a community member on Newfoundland's Health Research Ethics Board on the Clinical Trials Committee and a member of the Chair, Patient and Family Advisory Committee. Third, we have Dr. Jack Holland, who is a previous REB Chair for Hamilton Health Sciences, the Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board, and the UHN Oncology Research Ethics Board. So thank you all very much for speaking today, and I'll pass it on to Antonia.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. If you could go to the next slide for me, please. So hello, everyone. I hope you're all well. So when I was conducting research into the role of the community member on research ethics boards, I unfortunately didn't find much. But interestingly, what I did find was a collection of poetry around the lay member role. So you can tell by the use of the term lay member instead of community member and the use of the word subject instead of participant that the poem is a little dated. However, this display of love for the community member is one that I happily accept. The next slide, please, Sam. So as a quick refresher, the role of the community member on research ethics boards is a required role according to the Tri-Council policy statement. And the community member is a non-scientific, non-affiliated role, and their primary responsibility is to reflect the views of the participant in research. Next slide. So we heard from Susan a little bit about the CHEER initiative. And the CHEER Patient and Family Advisory Committee, or PFAC, is an important group within CHEER. Our PFAC is a national network of REB community members. And we also have one member from the National Cancer Institute Central Institutional Review Board, or CIRB. And we also have other members who have a keen interest in the intersection of the public and research ethics. So our PFAC has a voice within all aspects of CHEER and are recognized as vital contributors and decision makers. Our group will play a major role in the development of the educational and training materials that Susan talked about, especially those for community members on REBs for when they first join an REB and throughout their experience as a member on a research ethics board. Next slide, please. So our CHEER PFAC are members from across Canada, and they serve on a variety of ethics boards and bring varied professional experience to the role. We are exceptionally lucky to have such an engaged group who bring thoughtful insights on the role of the community member and their needs. Next slide, please. So when the CHEER PFAC first formed, and we formed earlier this year, for our first task, we decided that it was really critical to better understand the role of the community member so that we could really have a much clearer and broader picture of their needs and requirements. We decided to conduct an interview-based needs assessment. And this needs assessment really built upon another needs assessment that was conducted by the CHEER Education Committee. The CHEER Education Committee's needs assessment surveyed the wider REB membership, where ours focused really only on the role of the community member. So to date, we've conducted 14 one-hour, one-on-one interviews with community members who are on REBs that review pediatric studies or pediatric and adult studies. We hope to complete a total of 20 interviews in the coming months. The interviewees are from across Canada, with one interview being from the NCI-CIRB. The interview questions really center around the role of the community member, their perception of how their role is valued, the onboarding and ongoing training that's provided, and the desired onboarding and ongoing training that could be provided to help them in their role. Next slide, please. So I'd like to now share some of the preliminary analysis that we've completed for the first 14 interviews. First, we'll talk about the role of the community member and their REB. So overall, with these interviews, we found that REBs typically meet monthly. However, there are some that meet every 2 or 3 weeks. The meeting length tends to vary and can range from 2 to upward of 6+ hours. And the number of studies reviewed in a meeting also varies, anywhere between 3 to 12 new studies per meeting on average. But this would not be including amendments or continuing reviews. So if we kind of try and guess an average from that, calculate that average, it's about 8 new studies per meeting. And the majority of the REBs review adult and pediatric studies. However, some of them only review pediatric studies from those people that we interviewed. So next slide, please. So the role is most often called community member. However, there are some that use the term public member. And most often there is more than one community member on an REB. However, there are some that only have one community member. The community member tenure on an REB does vary greatly, with some being in the role from 1 year to over 10 years. For community members interviewed, they had been in the role for an average of 5 years. And community members typically review all of the studies in the meetings they attend, and they are not often divided up between community members if there's more than one on the board. Next slide, please. Almost all of the community members are university educated with advanced degrees and professional designations. Most identify as female, and they bring varied experiences and perspectives to the role. However, they are all highly, highly committed volunteers. Next slide. So most community members have, next slide. And forward again, there. Most community members have only one experience on an REB, and most bring the caregiver or patient perspective to their role. Few community members bring only the public perspective to the role, so the perspective of having no experience with health-based research. Community members rarely act as a primary reviewer, and this has only occurred within one of the members that we interviewed, and that was only for low-risk studies. Community members sometimes act as a secondary reviewer for a study. However, this is also rare. Forward, please. So almost all community members are directly recruited for the role, and most don't seek out the opportunity. Recruitment most always happens by the chair of the REB or by other community members. So through the interviews, there appeared to be a bit of a different level of confidence with those members who were recruited by the chair. And possibly this dynamic aids in creating an initial level of comfort for a person when entering the role as a community member. Next slide, please. Most community members are compensated, but some are not. And this ranges from $50 to $400 per meeting, with an average of about $250 per meeting. So pre-COVID, parking costs were covered for everyone. For some, travel costs were covered. And for most, a meal was also provided during the meeting. Unfortunately, very few community members receive an annual thank you from their REB. And for those that do, they are often also provided with a review of their year's activities that might include information like how many meetings were attended, number of studies reviewed, and other information. Next slide. Many community members are not compensated. 6 out of the 14 interviewed are not provided with a meeting honorarium. One member meets every 2 weeks for 3 hours, not including preparation time. One member meets every 3 weeks for 2.5 hours with additional preparation time. And 4 members meet monthly for upwards of 4 hours with additional preparation time on top of that. So this is a significant amount of time and effort is done completely on a volunteer basis. So next slide, please. So overall, the transition to the virtual REB meetings during the pandemic has gone very smoothly. Most community members feel that there's been less discussion on studies in comparison to when meetings were conducted in person. And one challenge that was noted during the interviews is that informal and visual cues that a member might pick up on in an in-person meeting are much harder to see during virtual meetings. So community members in particular look for nodding heads or that furrowed brow when they're speaking to gauge whether what they're saying is valid or not. When cameras are off or when you can only see a small number of people on the screen, these important cues are much harder to pick up on. Next slide, please. All community members enjoy being in their role. They feel that they're able to give back and do important work, even though it is a lot of work. Next slide. So all community members feel that their role is understood and valued by other members on the REB. Many expressed that feeling confident and competent in their role are two very different things. That it's possible to feel competent in how to conduct the review, but developing that confidence to speak up during a meeting may take much longer to develop. It can be a bit of an intimidating group to sit within when you're a community member. So most community members shared that it took about a year to feel comfortable in their role. Next slide, please. Community members feel that their voice is equally valued by those of the other members. And there's always the concern about asking that ignoble question, otherwise known as the stupid question. However, what's important to know is that these questions can often lead to really, really great discussions and points. But the creation of an environment of trust is so important when it comes to these ignoble questions. And that environment of trust is really shaped by the chair and vice chair. And this is critical for developing a place of open dialogue. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk about the training and education that was provided to community members and what we learned from the needs analysis within this area. So at the time of onboarding, most community members have completed TCPS2 core online, and many stated that they felt like it was really important information that they learned from the TCPS2 course, but many felt that it didn't prepare them for how to conduct an ethical review of a research study. Unfortunately, few tend to refer back to TCPS2 when conducting reviews. But there are also some community members who had no training at all. And unfortunately, no community members received any pediatric specific ethics training when they came into their role. Next slide, please. So onboarding training consists of different things: observing meetings, presentations from the REB Chair or the REB administration, the TCPS2 core online course, one-on-one meetings, but most importantly, they learned very much through watching how other REB members conduct ethics reviews. Some also received technical training on the systems that they utilize to submit comments for their ethical review of studies, but many have to kind of figure that out as they go. Next slide, please. Almost all community members said that they would have felt more competent in their role sooner if they had received more comprehensive onboarding education. Almost all members said they would have liked pediatric specific training at the time of onboarding. Next slide, please. So now let's just look at ongoing training. So just over half of the community members interviewed are provided ongoing training. And this can include educational retreats, being sent articles on emerging research and issues, emails from the REB administration on clarifying processes. One member receives small 15-minute training sessions at the start of each REB meeting. And there's also the ability for some to attend ethics-based webinars and conferences. Next slide, please. So now we wanted to look at what are the desired training topics and areas of education that community members would really like to have more training on. Next slide, please. So one major area is really focused on the area of almost like clinical trials 101. What is the REB and what are their roles, the description of these roles, the expectations around each role, the description of the different REB documents and forms. What are their names? What information do they contain? When do they need to look at them and how do they access them? The overall health research process. Where is Health Canada involved? Where is their REB involved? What does that larger landscape look like? And how do all the processes and pieces fit together? And of course, terminology and acronyms. Next slide, please. The next area that was mentioned quite a bit was in the world of clinical trial design, looking at the different clinical trials and how they can be designed for health research. Controls, arms, the difference between platform, umbrella, or pick the winner trials, phase 1s, 2s, and 3s, and how do they differ from one another? What's the difference between interventional, behavioral, observational, and registry clinical trials? And a big one is the use of placebos and the research design around the use of placebos and their rationale. Next slide, please. In terms of consent and assent, areas that that community members really wanted training on are things like, do parents and children understand research in the clinical trial they're enrolling on? What is sort of the common versus the ideal consent process? And how does the consent process differ from low risk to high risk studies? How do you ascertain understanding of the child for assent? And of course, the consent form. Does length matter? If a consent form is too long, will this impact the participant understanding? Are things like visualizations in consent forms helpful? And what are some of these other methods that you can be able to gain consent, to achieve consent for participants on a study? Next slide, please. And in terms of pediatrics in particular, community members really wanted to understand, how does pediatric clinical trial differ from adult clinical trial design? What are the challenges in designing for clinical trials for pediatrics, and how are they addressed, especially for such small patient populations? What are the burdens that families are willing to accept when enrolling on a clinical trial? And very much, there is also quite a few comments of that centered around the genetic and genomic data that's collected within clinical trials, and how do you deal with the return of results, be they actionable or not? Next slide, please. So coming from all of this research, what are some of the recommendations that we can take away from the analysis to date? The first recommendations that I'll go through are really those that are centered around for REBs as a whole. So in terms of onboarding training, that REB 101 training is really important. Who are the people on the REB? What are their roles? What do they do? What are the names of the documents? These things are all really critically important to set that really common and foundational understanding. Onboarding training really does need to be tailored to the community member. They will have different educational needs and questions. And for those REBs that are reviewing pediatric studies, really try and include some training that is specific to conducting the ethical review of pediatric research. If possible, it's recommended to establish a formal mentorship between the community member and experienced member of the REB. And hopefully before conducting a review, allow the community member to observe at least 1, maybe 3 meetings to see how it's done. And where possible, provide members, all members, but with a checklist of elements to consider when conducting ethical reviews. Next slide, please. So provide community members with feedback on how they're doing in their role. Help them understand where they can improve and give those kudos when great work is done. As we talked about earlier, this is so important, especially with virtual meetings when the visual cues aren't available to help community members know if they're on the right track. Talk to your community members regularly, individually or all together with other community members on the board. Check in with community members after meetings, especially if it's been a particularly hard one, or if there was a really sensitive discussion that took place. Next slide, please. And say thank you. It is so simple, but only a handful of community members receive a yearly email thanking them for their efforts. Next slide, please. So in terms of ongoing training, where possible, provide training in a just-in-time fashion on important topics, scientific concepts, especially as they relate to upcoming meetings, or even after a meeting. Make those educational resources available and potentially offer to pay the cost of attending ethics webinars or conferences. And if anything changes, like a consent template, the electronic system, or any processes, ensure that all members, especially community members, are trained so that everyone is working from a similar understanding as much as possible. Next slide, please. The chair's role is critical, and we'll be hearing more about this shortly. But for the community member, it is so important that the chair create that environment of trust, making it a safe place to ask that ignoble question. And when those questions might not be ones that are ignoble and might not relate, handle that situation with grace. So it's about ensuring that all members have the opportunity to provide input on a study if desired, and allow members to provide feedback on the processes and roles within the REB to strive for continuous improvement. Next slide, please. For community members, look before you leap. Learn about the role and what is involved before taking on this responsibility. It can be a heavy workload, but it can also be hugely rewarding. Most importantly, if you have a question, ask it. If you have something to say, say it. Your words, input, and questions are all important. And if you are offered training, say yes. It's a steep learning curve, so don't beat yourself up if you find yourself learning something new long into your tenure as a community member. Next slide, please. So just like all of the roles on the REBs, the community member role is a critical one. Community members bring many perspectives to their role, all of which can help with the ethical review of research. Education and training are critical for all roles on the REB, and maybe even more so for the community member. Providing thoughtful, targeted, and customized onboarding and ongoing training will help create both competent and confident community members. So I'd now like to give the floor to Gerard McDonald, who will speak about his experience as a community member on an REB.
Thank you, Antonia, and greetings from Newfoundland to everybody who's online here. I've been introduced already. My name is Gerard McDonald. I'm nearing the completion of my first 3-year term as a community member on the Research Ethics Board here in the province. I found I'm a retired human resources executive, and I looked for a couple of opportunities to contribute and give back to the community, I guess is how it started for me. Found this opportunity on our Research Ethics Board by word of mouth, really. Wasn't actively recruited, but wasn't really well advertised either. But I'm very happy that I took this on. My motivations for becoming involved were to, contribute and give back. But the type of work that's done by the Research Ethics Board is certainly something that fits with my background from a research standpoint, from a health and wellness standpoint, and just generally from the standpoint of finding opportunities to be able to make processes better and contribute to people in need. That's just, those are the things that interest me. A couple of quick comments about our REB, and then I'll move on. And by the way, I don't have a slide deck. I was asked to sort of take 5 to 10 minutes to share my personal reflections on the role of the community member from my vantage point. And so I'll be pretty conversational about this. I'll be speaking from some points here that I want to make sure I cover, but you won't be seeing a deck. About our REB, it's established by statute in our province, probably the same way it is in most other places, by our Health Research Ethics Authority Act. We have 3 committees, actually. I'm on the Clinical Trials Committee, and there is also a non-clinical trials committee and a Genetics and Genome Research Committee. All committee members, as far as I know, are part-time and are all volunteers. I'm retired. I'm one of maybe 2 retired members on our committee. All others have regular day jobs. An interesting aspect of our operation is that we have a 30-day decision timeline under our act. From the time that an application comes into our online portal or into the office, we have 30 days in which to render a decision. So that drives a number of things, but one of the things it does mean is that we meet every 2 weeks on a regular basis, obviously, for usually a minimum of 2 hours, and we will go up to 3 hours if we need to get through the agenda. And from time to time, we've had to meet through email or other means in between meetings as well in order to get work done. So this webinar explains basically 2 key questions. What is the community member's role, and how do we effectively engage their perspective? So what I decided to do is sort of anchor back to those 2 questions. And in sharing my reflections, I'll talk about, first of all, my understanding of the role, my role as a community member, in other words, and talk about role clarity for me and how I developed it, if you will. And then secondly, I'll talk about performing my role as a community member and hopefully as an effective community member, and talk about and share some reflections on that. So to begin with, understanding the role of the community member. 3 years ago, I didn't go through a sort of systematic formal orientation process per se, but I took really good guidance from 3 key places. Our HREA Act, to begin with, is clear on a couple of points and says that the authority shall appoint at least 1 person to represent the general public. When I first read that, I was uncertain, to be honest, as to what that encompassed, but there's a lot more clarity provided by in other places. So it also says that the REB must apply 1 or both of TCPS2 and or the ICH harmonized tripartite guideline for good clinical practice. And as it turns out, our REB's terms of reference require that both will be followed. So if you move on from there and look at TCPS2, which, by its very nature is essentially all about ensuring ethical conduct for research involving humans and with a focus on patients and participants and their families. If you look, first of all, at the core principles underneath TCPS2, respect for persons, concern for welfare and justice, obviously, these are things by their very nature that focus on the subjects of human research, patients and participants and their families. And then in particular, Article 6.4 of TCPS2 talks about the role of the community member and talks about that person's primary role being to reflect the perspective of the participant. So that was very helpful to me when I saw it for the first time, and I provided some context. But it also indicated that the community member was a person who normally is not affiliated with the institution. And then thirdly, just picking up on that last point, when I got involved actually with the committee, I realized when I looked at who was sitting around the table that as a community member, I was really the only person there who, first of all, wasn't affiliated with Eastern Health or the university or the Department of Health per se. So I didn't have any of those affiliations, but I didn't have a specialized function either. So everyone else around the table had a clinical perspective, an ethics perspective, a legal or privacy perspective. And so as a community member on our REB, and I suspect it's the same elsewhere, that has that sort of independent perspective without an attachment per se. And for me, this reinforced a sense of, if you will, independence and encouraged me to, make sure I had an exclusive focus on the participant. Other things helped. There was a full orientation package provided when I came on board, but it relied on a self-directed review. So as opposed to, for example, people being brought together and going through a formal orientation program, although I was offered one-on-one education with the ethics officer, and that was available. Importantly, there was a transition period. So the previous community member who later left that I had replaced stayed on for several months, I remember. And so I was in observer status for the first few meetings. And then finally, mandatory TCPS2 certification was part of the program as well. And I did mine online, which I would agree with Antonia and some others who she interviewed, that not totally effective, but for me, I blended that with sort of an offline review of that thing myself. And from time to time, I have gone back to it, though not as often as I expected I would, to be honest with you. But all those things helped me in developing clarity around what was expected of me as a community member in our REB. So finally, I'll just share some quick reflections with you on that aspect of things around role clarity and the role of the community member. First thing I would say, and Antonio highlighted this as well, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot that goes on inside REBs that's medical and scientific in nature. It can get pretty complex when people start talking about, unique medical conditions and sample determination methodologies and so on and so forth. But I found that gaining confidence with the ethics review process itself, medical terminology, genetic research and biobanking trends, clinical practice standards, and all that stuff was far more of a challenge than developing that clarity around my role as a community member. So there's a lot to learn there. I did and do feel that community member role was highly valued by the chair and all other REB members who, as well, wear that second hat, as far as I'm concerned. That's been my experience in sharing a focus on the patient and on the participant. A reflection of mine now is I probably should have taken advantage of one-on-one orientation. And mandatory group orientation might have been a better option as well, where possible. We've had limited education, or I have educational exposure to relative pediatric populations, and that's simply a function of the fact that we've seen very few research studies that have been exclusively focused on pediatric populations. I'm not sure there have been any. There probably have been, but mostly we see national and international studies that involve adult populations, or if adolescents and young patients are involved, they're part of the total research study population. So, and I know that there are unique ethical considerations associated with those types of patients, and not just those patients, but parents and other immediate family members. So that's a bit of a gap. I've sometimes wondered about the utility of our current ICF model, informed consent model, from a participant's perspective. These can get pretty complex and fairly lengthy as well. On the one hand, we all understand the critical importance of ensuring that patients and participants and their caregivers completely understand what they're signing on for when they go into a research study, no question about it, and it should all be mapped out. But they can become quite cumbersome. So I've wondered from time to time, and we've discussed this as a team as to whether there might be a better approach. So that's it in terms of understanding my role as a community member. Obviously, a clear focus on the patient and the participant. One little nugget I'll share is that there have been one or two occasions when, maybe this is a personal thing, I've wondered how far ethical considerations should extend to the quality and worth of the research itself. There might have been one or two times over the last 3 years when we as a team have gotten ourselves into a conversation around, gee whiz, are the research team going to get what they need out of this research study? And so we ended up questioning ourselves around the utility or value of the research. And of course, if you end up wondering that to yourself, you begin to wonder whether from an ethical standpoint, it's the right thing to impose on patients and participants. But that's a bit of a one-off, unique issue. And I wouldn't say that we ever found ourselves in the position of having to make a decision one way or another on the research study on that basis. It's just that one or two times what we've seen has provoked that kind of dialogue. So moving on very quickly to talking about performing my role as an effective community member. And that has two dimensions to it from my vantage point. One is, what should the community member do to be more effective as an individual member of the REB? That's with them, but what can others do as well to effectively engage that community member perspective? So it's a matter of the individual community member and other REB members and what they can do to effectively engage that person. Again, things that helped me be what I hope an effective community member, learning to start with the big picture threshold question. So it took a number of meetings before I realized that, what you need to do is start at a higher level here. And, first of all, concern yourself with whether there are any, big picture showstopper ethical issues with this study. What's the study about? What is it designed to do? What's the merit of it? And inside all of that, do you see anything obvious, that's a major ethical issue? The rest is important, but it's sort of secondary to that core issue. Learning where to focus when reviewing applications and ICFs. And this is something I learned myself, but on reflection, maybe some coaching along these lines might have been helpful. But I learned after a while to sort of refine that process. Realizing that I wouldn't fully understand everything. I can put it that way in layman's terms, I suppose, but I mean, some of these research studies can be pretty complicated, and I don't think really any REB member for that matter, but certainly any community member should be expected to fully digest and understand all of the medical aspects and scientific aspects and statistical aspects of some studies. So another way to flip side to that is, a community member shouldn't be intimidated or scared off by the fact that they may not get it all for sure, because there are other people around the table whose role and function is to help that. We use standard REB template language and for informed consent, which has been very helpful. Not everybody adheres to it, but it has helped us in our work to be more effective and efficient. I would have to say, and these are random thoughts to a certain extent because this is very important to me, and I highlighted it earlier, having supportive REB colleagues who operate in a collaborative environment. I mentioned earlier that my sense from the get-go is that everybody on our REB shares that collective focus on the participant and the patient. So while they bring specialized functions to the table and a unique focus, we all share that priority as well. Meeting attendance continuity for me personally was pretty important. So not that applications would carry on for 2 or more meetings, is just that having continuity at the table from one meeting to the next, to the extent that you can manage to do it, for me personally was pretty important. You're staying in tune with what's going on. And last but not least, I'd have to say, and I'll repeat this later as well, effective REB leadership and meeting governance. I'd almost put that at the top of any list here in terms of things that have helped me and have helped our REB, but certainly have helped me as a community member. You know, having co-chairs who will get things organized and lead those meetings in such a manner that everybody feels engaged, but is done in a way that ensures we're effective and efficient in getting our work done. And that's a bit of a challenge for sure. Some possible improvement opportunities, perhaps, go through these quickly. Having a better understanding of the wider clinical trial research context. So in her slides, Antonio talked about the overall health research process. So understanding who plugs into who, you know, in the overall research process, whether it's the national and international research groups or government funding agencies or regulatory agencies like Health Canada or you know, institution-based REBs, whatever the case may be, having a good, you know, handle on how all that fits together. Certainly periodic feedback on performance. Absolutely, you know, I've been used to that in my work life and in my career, and there's nothing like getting on as, you know, private feedback on how you've been doing and what you might change to make things better or whatever the case may be. And regular educational opportunities. So maybe on a semi-annual basis, you know, there's an opportunity to bring people together and just you know, focus on a trend or an area of research. In my case, probably I would be picking things like pediatric research and genetic research trends and things of that nature. Finally, some reflections on effectively engaging the community member perspective. So speaking more broadly than just me as a member of an REB, again, I'll repeat, effective REB leadership and meeting governance. We have good fortune here at my REB, as far as I'm concerned, with having that. So you don't have to worry about being, you know, ignored is not the right word to use, but marginalized or not heard. Everybody's heard, everybody's engaged. You know, sometimes weird questions are asked, and certainly from community members, they do it, but there's never been an issue. So I'd highlight that always, that having good REB leadership and good practices around meeting governance is actually absolutely key. Regular team-based educational opportunities. So again, even on a semi-annual basis, opportunities are created to bring the team together to have a focus, not on an application, but on a topic, on an issue, on an ongoing trend. Performance feedback, I talked about that in the context of providing feedback to community members, but when you think about it, that should be a process that's in place for all REB members. So if there's feedback to be given to other REB members about the manner in which they are engaging others on the REB, including the community member representatives and REBs, that would be an important and valuable process as well. I've heard it mentioned from time to time that maybe one way of more effectively engaging community members would to have them act as secondary reviewers or a delegated reviewer. I've not had the opportunity to do either. We'll gladly take it on, but as I said in the meeting the other day, you have to strike a balance in our particular case, at least, where we run on a part-time basis using volunteers and meeting every 2 weeks in order to make sure we meet that 30-day timeline. We really do have to strike that balance between engagement and team, and then efficiency in getting things done. And I've never felt in the overall scheme of things that my perspective has been minimized in any way by virtue of the fact that I haven't had an opportunity to do these kind of reviews. But I take one on if I was asked, certainly. As a team player, I would, but I don't see it as being, you know, big or mandatory thing. Right. So that may have sounded rushed, but I'm finished.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gerard. Now we'll move on to Jack Holland to provide the perspective of an REB chair.
Before I start to get into my presentation, just a couple of little things that I need to say to put things in perspective. I've been an REB chair for 16 years. I've retired a couple of years, and of that 16 years, 9 were exclusively in the area of oncology, which does affect how you think about things a lot. So a couple of things about this particular presentation. One is I'm not going to touch really at all on pediatric studies, because I think from the point of view of the purpose of this meeting, I think we're talking about engagement as the primary topic, not necessarily the research itself. Secondly, having come from a background that's, at least for 9 years, has been exclusively to oncology, it does kind of change your thought processes a little bit, particularly about the meetings themselves. I was at Princess Margaret for those 9 years and also REB. And the thing about Princess Margaret, which I think you need to understand because it does influence how I interact with others, is that it may be the only oncology or cancer hospital in Canada that may be participating in a worldwide trial or with the US. This puts a certain amount of pressure on the REB. It puts pressure on the investigators to get the job done. And because a lot of those studies were phase 1 and phase 2, it means that the research participant is in fact a patient, and those patients may not have long to live, which means that our work at the REB has to be highly focused because we have to have an answer, yes or no, or maybe not next month or the month after, but within a few days of the meeting. So with that kind of context, let me just get into the few slides that I prepared. Thanks, Sam. All right, if you could, okay, this is good. So here's the premise, and I hope we can all agree with the premise, that if you want active engagement by every single individual serving in the Research Ethics Board, that's a good thing. And it's a good thing because it's in the best interest of research itself, it's in the best interest of ethics, and fundamentally, it's the best thing possible for the research participant or patient. Next slide, please. Now, that's easy, that's kind of have motherhood, but in reality, let's have a look at this. And this is actually a real agenda from a real REB meeting, in this case, an oncology REB meeting. And remember, during the day, you're a banker, or you're a retired homemaker, or you're a lawyer, and then suddenly you're faced with even the language of these two top items. Look at them. I'm not going to read them out. Just have a look at the language of those and divorce that from your everyday job and whatever you're doing. The reality is there's 8 more of these. There's 8 additional items, all of the same degree of complexity. And the time allowed for a typical meeting is 2 hours, let's say even 2.5 hours, which means that the time allotted to each discussion is about 10 minutes, or if you want to stretch it out, 15 minutes to get through the agenda efficiently, to review the studies, and to come up with a vote at the end that says yes, no, or perhaps. Okay. Next slide, please. So that's a challenge, and it's a particular challenge for non-medical people sitting around the table looking at complex studies. I think the initial challenge is the elephant in the room, and that's where the issue of full engagement has not been recognized as an entity unto itself. So in reality, no value has been really placed on the contributions of the community representative or the legal representative. It is felt perhaps that they're there to fulfill the TCPS requirements. That's kind of shocking, and it is shocking. And for the moment, let's just blame this on the leadership. Let's blame it on the REB and get on with it, and we'll come back and address it later. For the non-medical lay members, shall call them, of the REB, I can imagine, as I've done frequently over the years, the kind of questions that go through their head, particularly for that first few months of experience. I'm completely out of my depth. I just don't get it. Maybe I shouldn't have been here in the first place. I'm afraid of asking a stupid question. All the things that I think Antonia brought out in her survey. Here's something you've got to realize, that within certainly the level of oncology, the level of knowledge occupied by the medical oncologist is different from the radiation oncologist or the surgical oncologist. And so to some extent, everyone is kind of scratching their head and saying, what on earth is this study about? Next slide, please. So let's talk about potential solutions. And this is personal, it's as I see it. You may have other thoughts. You may, from your own experience, have other ideas how to address this. But I think let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about the screening for potential REB involvement. It's not for everybody. And I think if in the process of recruitment, somebody is brought onto the board who really is not equipped, either because they don't have the heart for it or the intellectual capacity for it, it's not going to work out, and you're going to get a lot of dropouts. And I think it's important at the very beginning that you're honest in the recruitment process, that you lay out the expectation that the learning curve will be steep, but you will also lay out I think, the importance that that individual will bring to the process, not just to getting the job done within the REB, but fundamentally for the welfare of the patient or the research participant, and also the advancement for ethically sound research. So his or her role in making all this happen has to be emphasized so that people are valued right from the moment they're through the screening process. I was kind of shocked when Antonia said that some people had never had an orientation program or had not been given online resources. And I'm going to show you an example in the next slide, not just yet, but in the next slide of what I did personally, and you may agree with it or not, but at least it's from where I'm coming from. But I'd like to point out from the beginning that most of the orientation sessions rightfully address the ethical issues, the tri-council policy kind of stuff, and really don't address the difficulties placed by the community member because of the complexity of a given study. So let's look at this is the actual agenda of the orientation sessions that I conducted at UHN. So just to remind you, I was the chair of the oncology board, but I took on the responsibility of recruiting to all of the boards and for having the orientation session for all board members, and there were 4 separate boards at UHN that time and now. So here it would be the typical breakdown. You can see it lasts 2 hours in length. It was mandated for everyone who wanted to sit in any of the boards. And the first section was, apart from the welcoming and getting to know who people were, is really, what is this particular board? What do we do? Who are the personnel? What are the forms that we use? Where do you think you'll fit in? And you can see I have a little section on there that says, what's in it for you? Because there has to be something in it for the individual. And I'm not talking about remuneration. I'm talking about some kind of intellectual or social enrichment that you will get from the process. If you are a medical person, it could be in the form of promotion and tenure. And I would like to think that for anyone joining the board, that the very fact that you're joining the Research Ethics Board would be recognized by your chief, and that when it came to tenure and promotion, that things like this mattered. Then we got into a little bit about the history of research ethics boards themselves. I'm not necessarily going back to Nuremberg trials, but I'm going back more into recent history of research ethics. And in a sense, why we actually have Clinical Trials Ontario today. It's because of duplication. It's because of inadequate or uneven approaches to reviewing the same study across the country. And I think for many people, it was a real eye-opener to realize that, in fact, what we really had to do was make Ontario or Canada a good place in which to conduct a clinical trial. And as Susan has probably told most of you in other settings, up to some point in time, we were actually losing our ability to do clinical trials by about 10% per year, which is not good, which is why we do have Clinical Trials Ontario. After that, we got into the big issues, and you can see that listed there, what is the process in our institution of actually doing an ethical and scientific review? What is the process that's easiest for you? What is a consent form? What tools do you have to help get the job done? And then we move into consent with a little touches of asset, because at UHN, we were not a pediatric institution, but that ratio could be changed significantly. And other nitty-gritty issues such as tissue banking, genetic research, the use of placebo, and at UHN in particular, what makes phase 1 clinical trials so different from other trials. So that's, an hour and 3/4 of time, and then we have 15 minutes at the end. Having said that, I do appreciate, just as Gerard has said, that most of the learning will actually come from hands-on experience, just listening, being at the table, participating, hearing the degree of debate, and as time goes by, more and more confidence will occur because of just listening to the process. Next slide, please. What I also did, which I think you might want to think about, is provide resources right up front during the orientation process itself. And I did this, and this accumulated over several years of putting together which I thought were pertinent resources for people coming in fresh. I put them on a USB drive, about 1 gigabyte of information. How often they were consulted, I'm really not sure, but I choose to think that from time to time, people will go to this and say, I get it. And those were the kind of things that would be on the USB drive when I gave them away at each meeting. So genomics, genes, tissue biobanking, genomic research, consent, assent, capacity consent, stuff such as payment in research, fraudulent research, radiation risks, which I'll come to in a second as an example, return of findings, and then issues that surprisingly come up quite frequently: sex, race, and ethnicity in clinical trials. More recently, contraception in clinical trials. And then for our oncology board, oncology concepts, cancer drugs and mechanisms, and article resources. And bundled with all of this were slides which I found I was using frequently because topics would keep on recurring. So every person got that to take home with them at the orientation meeting. The next slide will show an example of one of the educational resources. This is just maybe 3 slides out of a deck of maybe 12 or 15. This is about radiation risk. One slide very quickly just tries to tell people what kind of background radiation there is. This is an important slide here because it tells people what are the radiation exposure of various procedures that crop up frequently during clinical trials as compared to something standard, such as a single X-ray. So if you look at this, for example, you can see that a CT scan of the chest, abdomen, and pelvis right at the bottom there is equivalent to 1,300 chest X-rays or a background radiation exposure of 13 years. That's quite sobering to think about. Next slide. Next slide, please. And we'll again put this in some kind of pediatric perspective, saying that if you're a young person or a child, your risk of developing cancer much later in life will be much higher than if you're an 80-year-old. So just a typical educational slide that would be part of the resource materials. Next slide, please. Right, this is where we might later on have some debate about the relative merits of this as an idea. So I see a part of the solution for community engagement and for adequate running of a research ethics board is really shared by the institution, the REB administration team, by the primary and secondary reviewers, and also by the chair. So let's talk about what the institution can do to try and facilitate a meaningful process. And one suggestion that I think everyone has probably already in action, but to varying degrees, is the requirement for a meaningful lay summary in the initial submission from the principal investigator to the REB. I say meaningful because in my experience, it's all over the board. And I've got to know over the years which units provided terrific summaries of the study and those that did not. And there's real opportunities for the REB to engage with the institution in a meaningful way, in a collaborative way, to try and say, listen, here's a way you can do it better to make life easier for you and to make life easier for us. I would suggest that the summary should follow a suggested template designed by the REB. It should, of course, be free of jargon, but it should also not be considered as something, that you just have to do because the REB says so. I think you have to convince the investigators, the people filling in those forms, that the whole purpose of this is to facilitate the meeting itself, which is in the best interest of your research study and the best interest of getting a verdict from the REB sooner rather than later. Something you may want to talk about is whether the requirement for a good lay summary is a check of whether you're going to accept the study or not. Personally, I have said to several investigators in the past, we will not accept your study at next week's meeting because the lay summary is not adequate. And I'm going to give you 48 hours to do it. And here's my suggestions how it should be done. Let's think about that and maybe discuss about it later. I think there's also a role on the primary and secondary reviewers because they should understand right from the beginning that, particularly during the screening process, that when they're conducting their job, it's with the view that the people in the room are not necessarily your peer group. People in the room are community members, lawyers, statisticians, and so on. And right from the very beginning, there should be a feeling of mutual respect for the process of getting the job done in a way that everyone truly feels that they're contributing. Next slide, please. This is a summary it actually goes back to that second example slide that we showed a little bit earlier. This is actually from a true REB meeting. It's a summary which occupies one slide or approximately 1/4 of a page. And I would say that it's not necessarily in lay language. It's still fairly complicated. But what I would say was that if you as a community member see the same format at each and every study for a particular meeting, and if this format is followed for every meeting, you will very quickly come up to speed with all perhaps 8 or 10 agenda items, because you'll be able to look at this and say, I get it, I understand it, I see what the discussion is going to be all about. So if you look at the components of this, you have the study fundamentals. In this case, you take the patient's blood, you separate out the white cells, you splice in protein of interest, and you reinfuse it back into the patient. There's a screening process, and those are the typical components of a screening process. Again, not lay language, but you're going to see this week after week, study after study, and after a while it begins to fall into place. There's blood work, there's x-rays, there's eligibility criteria, and then the intervention itself, and there's a brief little description of the needs of what the intervention is about. Then the list then of the primary objectives, the objectives by which the study will be judged, primary and secondary objectives. And then finally, what is the extent of the study? Well, we can see here that it involves 70 patients across all sites, and locally 4 at this particular sites, and those are the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So 1/4 of a page, and this could be perhaps the distillation of a 300-page protocol or a 30-page REB submission. Not an easy thing to do, and I would submit there are people who do it well and people who don't do it well. But I would suggest to you that if you've made an effort of trying to get some consistency in the summary aspect of a submission, it's going to make life easier for everybody and perhaps get the job done easier. Next slide, please. Finally, the role of the chair itself. And before I make any statements, I do appreciate that there is a difference between a chair who is doing this job in a full-time capacity with no other competing interest, versus the role of a chair who's doing this in addition to his or her full-time job within the institution or elsewhere. So having said that, I do think that the REB should take a role in recruitment. I think it should be done through the chair, so the chair feels that he or she knows who in fact is coming on board. And I think that's the opportunity right from the beginning of the chair to set the tone with regards to the expectation of teamwork in the overall process. As far as the REB leadership is concerned, and Gerard touched on this quite a bit, I'm glad to say that I think that the role of the chair is important, because the chair should set the tone regarding the expectations of the convened meeting itself. If necessary, the chair should redirect the meeting when it begins to get off into the stratosphere, bring it down to earth, engage people in the process. So at the end of the meeting, and this may sound a little hokey, but I got personal satisfaction when we all left the room saying, we did a good job today. That was a job well done. All issues were addressed. Everyone contributed. And I think that can only happen if most of the work is done in advance. Most of the issues are highlighted and brought to the table well in advance in the written format, so that everyone has a chance to read it, understand it, so they come to the meeting itself better informed and ready to participate. The next slide, please. Education. I think this is the last slide. But I think Gerard and I think the survey that Antonio went over with us supported this. I think there's a role for continuing education at all aspects along REB involvement. My caveats about a full-time versus a part-time role as the chair are important. So with that in mind, I think personally the chair should be involved with the orientation of new members, both medical members of the board and non-medical members of the board and community members. I personally took a primary role of summarizing each study because I should have said I'm not an oncologist. I am a physician. I have a background in pediatrics and in endocrinology. But it seemed to me that if I couldn't understand the essence of a study when it comes to the board, how on earth could I expect the lay members of the board to understand it? So I personally took on the role of summarizing each study, and that summary that you saw earlier was one of mine, and I did that for each of the studies coming to the board. But you could argue that time might be better spent if that was part of the institutional lay summary, or that the primary or secondary reviewer took on a similar responsibility in presenting something in a coherent manner before and during the meeting itself. I think the board also, so the REB chair also has a primary role in seeking clarification of any ambiguities about our respective studies. So frequently, surprisingly frequently, I would have to phone a PI in advance of the meeting and say, listen, we're going to be having your study coming up in 10 days' time. There's some aspects of the meeting which are really unclear, or they're different from a previous similar submission you put in. Could you clarify this in preparation for the meeting? Most investigators were very appreciative of this and said, oh, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity of doing this. Here's another go at it. Maybe this might make it clear for all concerned. I think from time to time, there are also landmarks in medical science that come through that really shake the foundations of what we do. I remember very well when the first of the big immunology studies came through, which is probably around about 2010, 2011, something like that. And after we grasped what the essence of the change in direction was, that became part of a recurrent submission of studies. And it seemed to me that it was important as chair that we prepared stuff for ongoing presentations that were focused on stuff that was new or of fundamental importance, or that were particularly of a recurrent nature. So, for example, emerging approaches in immunology, emerging approaches in radiation oncology, surgical oncology, or whatever, and even things such as definitions and terminology, which is new. And I find that the ability in a 10-minute overview to provide maybe one or two slides that focus on the issues, and this is the fundamental question that's being asked in this particular study. You can see light bulbs going on. People became engaged in the discussion. The comments, the review comments were received in preparation of the meeting. Everyone was engaged. We focused very clearly on the strengths and weaknesses of a study. And by the end of the meeting, we were in a position to say with confidence that everyone in unison was able to say, the studies can go, the study will leave some changes, the study cannot go. I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm going to leave it to Sam to tell us where we're going next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Antonia, Gerard, and Jack, for all those thought-provoking presentations and reflections. So now we're going to move into the discussion period. We have about 20 minutes. So please feel free to either type your comments or questions into the chat and I'll read them out, or you can use the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom window to raise your hand and I can call on you, or feel free to unmute and ask your question directly as well.
Thank you. This is actually extremely helpful. Everyone's points of view have been very detailed and very helpful specifically for us. So I'm from Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Ontario, in Toronto, and we're currently in the process of doing a recruitment for community members. Typically, as the survey said, we typically have gotten them through others at the hospital, through our chair, through our other individuals who work at the hospital. And so this time what we've done is put out a call on our web pages, tweet it out, actually a posting, almost like we're recruiting an employee. And so what I wanted to know from the different people here today, never really had an interview process for this community member role. And in thinking about it, we need to come up with questions and things that we need to look for or want to look for. So I was wondering if anyone had any good suggestions for the interview process on recruiting a community member, maybe some suggested things that we could look for or ask.
Personally, I met with each potential community member one-on-one. And I started by giving them an overview of the kind of stuff that they would be expected to deal with on whatever board they were going to be. Pointing out that in terms of UHN, it was a tertiary care center, that it would not be easy. And then give them the opportunity to ask me questions about anticipated difficulties that they might face. looking back over several years of doing this, there were only a few instances where somebody said, no, this is something I can't do. I either don't have the time, I don't feel I can get suitably engaged with this, or this is just beyond what I thought. I think most people that I came to interview over the years appreciated the fact that we're meeting with them, appreciated the fact that we give them a sense of what to expect right up front, and we're looking forward with some excitement to participating, knowing that they would have a period of time in which to find their feet. We would not throw them into the deep end. We would allow them to come to a few board meetings, even defer their decision about whether they want to be a member or not. After the beta 2 or 3 meetings, we would not immediately sign them on until they were comfortable and in a position to say, I think I can contribute to this. Gerard, what was your feeling about that?
I think I agree with all those comments. I didn't, as you all know now, go through a recruitment process per se. But I've been through and I've managed many recruitment processes in the past. And I think, you can actively recruit for this role, no problem. The key, as in any recruitment process, will be to clear in your own mind what it is that you are looking for in a community member, and what are the key aspects of background, key aspects of character and motivation that you're looking for in a community member, number one, so that you can assess objectively the people that you're talking to and looking at. And number two, as Jack has highlighted, I think you have to be very honest with people and paint a very accurate picture as to what the work on the board will involve. And through that process and through that line of questioning as well, I think you get an opportunity to assess the person's motivations, because I said to somebody over the last couple of weeks, I think to a certain extent, members on REBs, there's an element of self-selection involved. So I think probably, and that's because people gather their information from people they know, people who are involved in REBs, people who have been clients or whatever, as to what this entails. So painting a really good picture of what is expected and required of an effective community member will be critical. But having a clear picture of what you're looking for, that's really all I can add to the conversation.
Yeah, Tiffany, I think that's an excellent question. And absolutely, I think it's a little bit of it's not your more traditional interview. I feel like it is more of a discussion, and like Gerard said, I think it is important to ask, what are the other professional skills that that potential community member could bring to the role, because we're lawyers and engineers and some people have formal ethics training. So I think it still is important to ask, what is the perspective, what is the professional background that's brought, and where possible, trying to, and without breaching or causing any discomfort, asking what the lens is that that potential community member would view ethical studies through. I think that is a really important piece to understand as well. But it absolutely, I think it ends up being more of a, here's what you can expect in the role, and here's what it will be expected of you, which will be the most critical parts of those conversations in those interviews.
So we have a question from the chat. I'll just read it out. For those community members who were compensated, do we know if other members of the board were also compensated, or is remuneration specific to the community member role?
Yeah, for our needs analysis, that was something that we didn't ask, just because it's something that community members often don't know in terms of that remuneration for other members on the boards, if the board is remunerated. And I don't believe that was something that was also asked in our larger needs assessment, because that really focused on educational topics. But it is a good question, and certainly one which would be interesting to know the answers to.
There's another comment in the chat. With technology changing so fast and the persistent need for protecting the privacy of the participant, it is an area I feel would be important to have more education for me as a community member. So if any of the speakers would like to comment on that or reply.
Yeah, this is Gerard here. I'll speak to it very briefly. I mean, inevitably, and almost every application that we look at, we look closely at the conditions in place to protect confidentiality and privacy. And in our particular case, we have at least one privacy expert sitting with us at the table. And so, over the course of time, speaking as a community member with not a particular expertise in privacy, I've learned a lot from those conversations and from that person, in terms of how technology is impacting privacy these days. So I think you can rely a lot on that particular resource on your REB if you have one. But certainly it's probably a suitable topic as well for ongoing education because things are changing so rapidly, especially in the area of genetics and genetics research and the potential for the future in terms of tracking, that kind of thing.
If I could add to that, Gerard, I do think that's been recognized by ethics both here in the US and around the world in general. And I think it's reflected in consent forms. I think for the most part, our ballooning consent forms have ballooned out largely because of the need to put in additional language to safeguard the privacy of participants. And part of that pleases me a lot. It's just a matter of getting the language and bundling it into a way that doesn't make it more complicated. But I think even things like donating a piece of biopsy material, today, if it goes into a biobank, there's going to be probably a 2-page consent form that highlights the risks to your privacy of donating that tissue. And I think a really good consent form, in a way, can be an answer to those kind of questions to say, well, look, here's what our consent form says, And I actually think, surprisingly, that REBs have actually done a pretty good job of trying to cope with the avalanche of new information that's emerging out of genetics in particular, and try to convert it into a language that's meaningful to the research participants.
So, I think we have another question here in the chat, or a few here. So would it likely be advantageous to have a privacy expert as an ad hoc member, if not a regular member of the REB?
I'll speak to that quickly and say yes. We have one who's a regular meeting attendee and is a regular member of the REB. So I'll just be repeating what I said earlier, but you benefit a lot from hearing that person deal with privacy issues, unique issues that come up from time to time. It's an education for sure.
Another question in the chat. How many REBs have Indigenous community members, and are these specialized and in addition to other typical community members?
Again, I can have a stab at that. UHN had no Indigenous community members on it, but there is a requirement from Tri-Council policy that if a study involves Indigenous populations, there is a requirement, a mandatory requirement for inclusion of Indigenous members on the board. In Kingston in particular, as far as I know, there's been very positive moves towards involvement by Indigenous members on REBs. Is that not the case, Suzanne?
I am not as aware. If someone else would like to speak up.
Yeah. I know there's a clause that's in all Kingston REB forms that says that if this study involves an Indigenous person, you should discuss this with your elder. I mean, there's language that takes into account the fact that there may be unique Indigenous elements to the study, and acknowledgement of the fact that the process of approval will require further discussion with people within the Indigenous community.
I was just going to say that years ago when I worked with the board, they definitely had an Indigenous member or a member representing the Indigenous community all the time in the board, and I suspect that has not changed.
Yeah, in Newfoundland, we have a very significant Indigenous population, but we don't have a requirement to interact or anywhere else, as far as I know, to have an Indigenous member of our board. But we do, as Jack is outlining, as part of our application process, there are questions asked with respect to whether the research involves Indigenous populations. And if so, I think there will be an expectation, although I can't say this for certain, that the research sponsor or the study proponent will be required to, provide additional further information in terms of the consultation that has occurred to ensure that, anything that's unique about the research as it relates to those populations is addressed.
So I have a question for both the speakers and any attendees who would like to share their experience. Has a community member on your board ever served as a secondary reviewer for a study? And if so, what types of resources were provided to support that role as a secondary reviewer?
Again, I can give you my experience. Yes, we have offered that role to community members. Typically, they've been on the board for quite some time. Typically, they would be approached in advance to gauge their level of comfort with it. And there'd also be an understanding right from the beginning that their particular role would be to look at elements of the consent form from the perspective of the community representative to make sure that the language of the consent form adequately refers to the science of the application. I have found that in that role, most community members do a very good job, take it very seriously, and add significantly to the final decision.
Yeah, Sam, I think that's a great question. And in our interviews, we found that this happened very infrequently. And it was for particular studies. So one interviewee in particular, as a community member, he actually has acted as a primary reviewer, but they would only be on low risk studies. But I absolutely agree with Jack. I'm a lay member on the Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board, and I've never been provided with that opportunity to be a secondary reviewer. And I think that would be of great value. And I really do believe also that the community member would do an excellent job in being that secondary reviewer. Specifically, my area of focus is within understanding pediatric oncology. So if it was for one of those studies, I'd happily take on that responsibility. But I think that there are many community members who would really relish that chance to be able to be that secondary reviewer and to sort of push. And I think it is a way to push the skills and understanding forward of within their role. So I think it is absolutely a possibility. From what we're gathering from our interviews, it's not done very often. But I think, like Jack said, if it's someone who has been on the REB for a number of years, is feeling comfortable and confident to do that. Certainly, I think it's important to offer it, but allow that community member to say no, thank you. But if they say yes, please, to be supported and allow them to have that chance to act within that role.
Sam, if I could just add, to me, it also highlights some of the comments made initially, that I think it's so important that the difficult, scientific aspects of the study are very clearly spelled out, so that everyone involved knows what the science is about, and so that the secondary reviewer or the community person can get on with saying, and here's how the consent form can be written with respect to the information that's just been provided.
So it's seeing no more comments or questions unless I've missed someone. It looks like we've reached the end of our session. Thank you once again to the speakers for providing a great structure and education on this topic. And thank you very much to everyone who joined in for this discussion. I hope that you all have a great afternoon and evening, and hopefully you can join in on future chair workshops when we hold them. And thank you so much, all.
Thanks very much. Most informative. Thank you.